I'm well aware that as far as youthful audiences are concerned, that death happens to other people, old people, people quite different from yourselves, people whom you will not come to resemble. It does, at the end of the day, come to us all, alas, farther I hope it will be from what you're worrying and thinking about most of the time. And of course it's very important in modern demography, because as the population aging effect of low fertility fades away and becomes incorporated into the population age structure, in due course all future population aging will be caused by continued increases, or whatever increases there are, in expectations of life at birth, that in the future will drive population aging and will, of course, somewhat mitigate the effects of low birth rate on population decline. It's also, of course, a subject of immense scientific interest and possibly slightly macabre curiosity as well. This is the only lecture that I'll give on mortality. It'll have to be a mixture of empirical description and, I hope, an attempt at some sort of analysis as to what's going on, why it's going on, what the causes are, and all the rest of it. So, these are the sorts of things that I want to talk about. First of all, a simple description of the trends, the components of mortality decline, the causes of death, attempts at explaining what's been going on, and then to look to the future, to see what might happen next, what the prospects for longer life might be, what the current little bits of evidence are for the prospects of living longer. This is just to remind you of the pattern of mortality and to remind you of how hugely varied the risk of mortality is by age. This is a log transformed graph of the life table death rate, QX, for male and females in England and Wales around about 2001. It's about the same nowadays, slightly better. It gets better every year. But this is, you can take it more or less the pattern of risk that we are all exposed to. This varies a thousandfold. That's why it's transformed into a logarithm, because if it's not transformed into a logarithm, all this variation here down at the low end of mortality disappears from view, as you will see in the next slide. What this shows is that we have an infant mortality rate of about 4 deaths per 1,000 per year, which is very, very low. It's not the lowest in the world by any means. As we'll see, it's very low. Down here, mortality is almost negligible. In some European countries, some smaller European countries, from time to time, there are no deaths recorded at certain single years of age. I think there were no deaths recorded of children aged 8 in Sweden about 10 years ago, for example. If we could experience the rates of mortality which we enjoyed when we were little children, aged 8, 9, 10, as you recall from last term perhaps, we could live for 800 years. Unfortunately, that is not given to us. From that rather heavenly state of survival, things get worse into adolescence, peaking around, forgive my saying so, your time of life, as certain kinds of reckless behavior, especially among men, become predominant, with their girlfriends dragging along in their train. Then things calm down. And then from about 30 or so onwards, the Gompertz curve takes over, this exponentially increasing progression of rates of mortality with age, which continues continuously right until old age. There's some alteration of the exponential rate of the Gompertz curve in very old age, so that things don't go on getting quite as bad as you might expect, but more of that later on. Of course, you all know that when an exponential curve, one that's going like that, getting worse and worse and worse, is transformed into a logarithm, what you get is a straight line, and that's effectively what we've got here, 2 straight lines of mortality going up through the logarithmic scale, indicating the advance of mortality. First of all, unimportant. When it gets to about sort of 60, 70-ish, it starts getting a bit concerning. People of my age start getting rather too many funeral notices of our friends for comfort, but it gets really bad around here, but more of that later. This is the same data, or rather the same life table, turned into a different form. What we've got here is a non-log transformed rate of mortality, the non-transformed QX curve. the rate of death from one year to the next. Now, as I said, when it's not log transformed, all that variation around childhood, infancy, and young adulthood disappears from view. It becomes completely invisible because it's so low compared with the mortality which experienced later on after age 60, 70, 80, and so forth. This is the actual curve of death. This is the number of deaths each year. And you can see that according to this life table, the modal age at death, the most common age at death in the mortality of England and Wales at the present time is just over age 80. Most people who die nowadays die over age 80. It's that late. This is the track of that period expectation of life at birth. This is just the life table calculation of expectation of life at birth for England and Wales from 1850 right until about 2010. And you can see two general characteristics. One, a general rate of improvement. Two, the superiority of female survival over male survival. This is the expectation of life of females, of course, this of males. The rather modest pattern of improvement in the first decade or two of this graph, hardly any change at all. Partly, as you'll recall, due to the transfer of the population from the more healthy, or perhaps I should say less unhealthy, countryside to the more unhealthy towns. The actual rate of improvement, irrespective of that, was increasing, but because of the transfer of population to less healthy areas with very rapid urbanization, no overall change is apparent. And then we see the improvement getting stronger from the 1860s, 1870s onwards. The magnitude of the crisis mortality of epidemic disease getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Particular improvements in the interwar years from between the 1920s and the 1950s, and then a rather more modest but rather linear level of improvement up to the present day, with a widening of the gap between males and females. Down here, the difference between female expectation of life at birth and male was only about 2 and a bit years. By the time we get up to here, it's 4 and a half or so, something of that kind, although narrowing slightly for reasons we'll go into later on. Just to remind you there are other ways of measuring mortality, and to remind you particularly not to be misled by trends in the crude death rate in developed countries. If you look at the graph of the crude death rate in recent decades in developed countries, it will appear to you that there's no improvement whatsoever. And in some countries it's even possible to see an increase in the crude death rate, which seems contrary to reason. That is a perfectly true reflection of what the crude death rate is telling you, but the crude death rate is not telling you the truth as opposed to the real risks of mortality. Crude death rates are stationary or not improving very much or even getting worse in developed countries because the age structure is getting older. More of the population is concentrated in ages where the risks of death are very high. Ergo, the crude death rate, simply deaths divided by population per year, is bound not to change very much. If you look at the age standardized death rate, that is to say a crude death rate adjusted for the fact that the population age structure is changing, to remove that factor, you see quite a different picture. Here is the age standardized death rate for the 15 countries of the old European Union. This here is the crude death rate, as you see, from 1970 to 2002, showing hardly any improvement. This is the age standardized death rate, getting rid of this age structure factor, showing the true rate of mortality. And it indicates, just like the trend in the expectation of life at birth in the England and Wales data in the previous slide, it shows a continuous and substantial improvement over time, which so far has shown no signs of diminishing. This is This is a similar example from the United States. This is very common throughout the industrial world, except for Eastern Europe, of which more in a moment. Here is the crude death rate for the United States from 1960 up to 2005. Here's the age-adjusted pattern. Same thing as we saw in Europe. The age-adjusted pattern gives you a very substantial improvement over time. Again, not showing any signs of diminution. Here are two of the best performers. These get the prize, as it were, for the longest life so far. The solid lines are females. The lines with the markers on are males. Leading the pack, of course, is Japan. Japanese females with an expectation of life at birth by 2008 up to about 86.5, exceeding, of course, the pessimistic speculations of J. Olshansky and his colleagues. But of course, that's just for one country and one sex, not for the whole of the developed world, with Swiss females just behind. And for comparison, the rather more mediocre performance of the UK. Here are UK females still following the same trend, but not so impressively, and diverging. If you go back to the 1950s, the mortality rates were really very similar. We've lost ground compared with the Swiss. And here are the males, where the divergence is less great, with England and Wales still below the other two. The story is not always one of substantial improvement. Here is France, where France, which has the lowest mortality for females anywhere in continental Europe, contrasted with Denmark and the US. For males, the pattern of mortality is not dissimilar. For females, there's an interesting divergence whereby the mortality of French females continues to reduce. Expectation of life continues to increase. It just below 85 at the present time, whereas that of Danish females in blue and American females in green had a period of almost complete stagnation here, where there was no improvement whatsoever. That has now come to an end, and it's now picking up. Almost certainly this was due to lifestyle habits, particularly due to levels of smoking. So the epidemiologists believe. So it's not always uninterrupted progress. It's not always plain sailing. And indeed, you can see, if you look at the Danish males, here, a period of almost zero improvement in expectation of life at birth, stuck at about 71 ever since the 1950s up till the mid-1970s. Again, it is thought due to the high prevalence of smoking-related deaths, from which most populations are now liberating themselves among the male population, but then really imposed a flattening effect on mortality, so much so, and so widespread was that in the developed world, that it was supposed back in the 1960s that the possibility of improvements in expectation of life had ground to a halt, and that the patterns of heart disease, cancer, stroke were inexorable consequences of old age, and nothing much could be done about them, and we sort of hit the buffers as far as improvements in expectation of life were concerned. And you can see why there should be so much pessimism if you cut the graph off about here, for males anyway. But that is all now in the past, and things are back on track for improvement. Not everywhere. These are the extraordinary divergent patterns of the expectation of life of males in Western Europe compared with communist or former communist Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. What we have here are the expectations of life for Japan in blue, for Switzerland in pale blue, for this is Greece in purple, and this, I guess, this must be France, compared with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Hungary. And as you can see, back in the 1960s, if you looked at these patterns of mortality, they were not really distinguishable. Many of the countries of Eastern Europe had rather similar expectations of life at birth to those in Western Europe, and this was, of course, a source of enormous consolation to the communist powers in the Cold War period, when Khrushchev was threatening to bury us and all the rest of it. All that changed. That was the peak in the 1960s. From then onwards, things went downhill, or at least at the very best failed to improve throughout the entire communist world. I've only got 3 examples from the former Soviet Union and 1 from Central Europe, Hungary, but as you can see, the pattern is very similar. Various hypotheses advanced to try to explain this, which I'll try to talk about very briefly later on. But the fact is undoubted. There is also, it's important to realize, while there was a marked reduction in survival immediately after the end of communism, very much shown in Russia, also in Ukraine, to a modest extent in Belarus. Essentially, that was just a brief hiatus. The important thing about this mortality isn't the transient worsening of the position after the collapse of communism and all the chaos which accompanied that. It's much more that the fact that this pattern continued right until recent years, and only the last 2 or 3 years have things improved somewhat in Russia. But this level here, which is the expectation life of birth of 63, it's about 12 or 14 years lower than that in contemporary Western Europe, and is the level of a rather poor third world country, and is a really very remarkable phenomenon, of which more later. But do notice that those countries in the former Soviet Union have stayed put in this dismal position. Hungary, which emancipated itself from that system back in 1989, 1990, has now resumed the upward track which you would have been expected of it back in the 1950s, but which it was diverted from by this episode of change of control. This is just to pictorialize that and to show how interesting one can see an east-west gradient in survival. This is WHO data from 2005, expectation life at birth, divided into quintiles, into fifths of the distribution. The paler, the worse. And you can see that it's worst over in the east. It gets a bit better in Central Europe now. The darker countries are the ones with the most superior levels of survival. This is both sexes put together. You can see that France and Spain, Italy do rather well. Scandinavia does rather well. Germany, the Low Countries, Britain are a bit mediocre, along with Austria. Infant mortality still varies greatly. These data are 10 years old, but the pattern is the same, although it's a bit lower almost everywhere. You can't read which countries are which, but I've color-coded them. The countries of the former Soviet Union are appropriately in red: Russia, Moldova, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Countries in former Yugoslavia are green. Here is in Central Europe, green is Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. Down here, predictably, is Scandinavia, Iceland, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Luxembourg doing best of all. Of course, Luxembourg's got a GDP per head of $45,000 per head per year, compared with about $35,000 anywhere else. So if that can't buy you long life, then I don't know what can. Here is Central Europe in purple, Austria, Germany, France, and so on. A very interesting gradient from about infant mortality rate of 3 infant deaths per 1,000 births per year, up to about 18 or 19 at the other extreme. Interesting also to point out that there's quite a lot of variation within countries, which I haven't got time to go into, but which is certainly an interesting phenomenon. The old-fashioned pattern whereby mortality rates in the countryside, in lower density rural areas, suburban areas, small towns, are superior, lower, as it were, than those in major cities, still obtains. And you can see in England and Wales 2 sorts of gradients, which are fairly typical of Western Europe. First of all, the southern, more prosperous part, the Bristol Channel to the Wash, is paler, has lower mortality, longer expectation of life than that part of the country to the north and to the west. The former old industrial areas, South Wales here, the Midlands here, North Yorkshire, Newcastle and such areas, and also most of London have higher death rates. The country areas have pale death rates. Not all of London, of course, has high death rates. This is London magnified. This white blob here is Kensington and Chelsea, as perhaps you might expect. But really quite substantial differences in standardized mortality ratio. This goes from, if I can read it, from 122 up to 200 here, down to about 50 here. So very considerable variation in SMR from one part of the country to another. Also, of course, from social class. These are social class mortality rates. Again, standardized mortality ratios for men in age 20 to 64 from the longitudinal study. And as you can see, social class 1 in pink has an SMR of about, about 70 or so, compared with one of about 170 for social class 5, unskilled manual workers. a terrible graph which I borrowed from the Health Inequalities and Decennial Supplement. I'm sorry for the ghastly colour scheme and the obscurity of it. It does make the point if I can explain what the colours mean. This is the diversity within by SMR for men aged 20 to 64 by different causes of death. And these are, now look on here, on the left we have strokes. This is mortality by stroke, and this is social class 1, social class 2, 3 non-manual, 3 manual, 4 and 5. Major difference here. This is ischemic heart disease, heart attacks essentially, coronary thrombosis, very important cause of death. This is lung cancer, even more substantial difference because of the differences in smoking habits between social classes. Here is accidents and violence, and these are this is suicide. The only major difference, as you can see, exception is skin cancer. Skin cancer primarily caused by excessive irradiation by ultraviolet light. This is mostly malignant melanoma rather than other kinds of skin cancer which are curable. Malignant melanoma has all sorts of causes, but it's particularly provoked by strong exposure to sunlight. This reflects the ability of people to go overseas to the lovely south of France and Spain and such places for their holidays. Back in 1991, anyway, that was more customary among richer people, among social class 1 and 2 than elsewhere. That's why the mortality gradient is reversed. This is now much less true, partly because many more people can afford to go abroad to hot countries to enjoy their holidays, also because of the growing popularity of sunbeds and clinics for giving you artificial suntans, which are often far too powerful in terms of the radiation which they give. The only other major exception which you would get to that expected social class gradient is in cancer of the female breast, which isn't here, but where there's a slight higher level among higher social class because of the delay in childbearing characteristic of that. One of the major risk factors for cancer of the female breast is delaying childbearing. Has an effect upon the hormones which generate risk factors for contracting that disease. What about the causes? I've talked a bit about the causes already. Need to talk a bit more. This is a document which you will not see unless you're gazing down from heaven above with your own name on it. This is the medical certificate of cause of death, which by law has to be signed before you can be buried or cremated. And it is an attempt to assign the cause of death which led to your demise, which is often very difficult because, of course, the immediate cause of death may not be the one which is clinically and epidemiologically and demographically interesting. You may have a hemorrhage in your aorta, for example, or a brain hemorrhage, and that's the immediate cause of death, and that's what will be entered here. But the reason why you might have that is what really matters, what the underlying cause of that immediate cause of death would be, and that could be diabetes, or it could be atherosclerosis, or all sorts of other diseases of a more chronic nature, which predispose you to a violent end of that sort. Of course, it may also be that your loss of blood from hemorrhage might be because someone has stuck a knife in your chest, in which case that would go under one of the external causes of death of accidents and violence. There is a very elaborate international agreed classification of causes of death. There are 999 officially agreed ways in which you can die, each of which is subdivided among many other causes because, of course, the human body is enormously complicated. There are lots and lots and lots of ways in which you can go wrong. Nowadays, there are particular problems because, of course, given that most people die when they're aged over 80, by the time we're 80, we've acquired all sorts of terrible things. We've got little hemorrhages in our brain. We've probably got cancer, but not dying of it. We may well have some kind of diabetes. And the problem may be working out which of the morbid conditions from which you're suffering is actually the one which led to the cause of death. And that's difficult to do. It requires a great deal of clinical research to sort it out, and from time to time ideas on it are revised. And this down here, in this part of the form, the clinician is meant to write down what the other morbid conditions are from which the person is suffering, which did not directly cause death, but might have been indirectly contributory to it. And quite often there'd be 4 or 5 or 6 such causes. it's not allowed to put down diet of old age. That was forbidden because it was too vague and unhelpful many decades ago. It may well be that as time goes on and people live longer and longer and longer, accumulate more and more morbid conditions, that it becomes impossible to do anything else except in rather specific circumstances. The last government was always keen to look on the bright side, and just to cheer up the dead, they introduced a new attractive death certificate. Out went that grey document that I pointed out before, and in came a nice document in pastel colours embossed with the red rose for England and Wales and for other devices elsewhere. Nonetheless, the mortality remained the same. This is the pattern for England and Wales from 1970 to 2009, showing the rise and fall of diseases. We're accustomed, I think, to supposing that heart disease and stroke and things are always with us, or possibly even on the increase. One hears about an epidemic of cancer. Neither of these things are true. Back in the first half of the 20th century, it's certainly true that here in England and Wales and in other countries as well, deaths from what came to be called diseases of affluence were predictably and expectedly going up. These are age-standardized mortality rates for. This is for circulatory disease. That would include ischemic heart disease, heart attacks, coronary thrombosis, and strokes. This is respiratory disease, tuberculosis and influenza, going down, as you might expect, as health conditions improve. This is cancer, and this is infectious disease, diminishing down to more or less nothing. Until the middle of the century, around about here, as you see, the standardized death rate from circulatory disease, which is the most important cause of death, was actually going up, partly because the population was getting older and therefore moving, as it were, its centre of gravity into that part of the distribution where these risks become very much more severe. People of your age don't get that kind of condition. People of my age do. But also because of a change of diet, a change of activity, all sorts of risk factors were increasing at that time. Cigarette smoking was increasing. At that time, the standardized mortality ratios for circulatory disease by social class were the reverse of what you saw in that previous graph. It was the better off people who were dropping dead from heart attacks, not the workers doing manual work. That's now completely reversed. In those days, though, it was thought to be clearly, really, genuinely diseases of affluence. The richer you got, the better your diet, the worse things were from the point of view of heart attacks. Cancer also was creeping upwards and peaked around about 1971, 1981. Since then, things have got a lot better. In England and Wales, as elsewhere, there's been a huge reduction in mortality from circulatory disease, partly because of great improvements in lifestyle, the decline of smoking, the recognition of the importance of diet, all sorts of other things, plus, of course, really important innovations in drug control of blood pressure and cholesterol and the other risk factors of circulatory disease, and surgical intervention, bypass surgery, stents, all the other things which you read about, which can save life in a way completely impossible 30 or 40 years ago. And that's why it's going down so dramatically, now lower than it was in 1911 and still heading downwards. Cancer, much more troublesome. Cancer, of course, is a whole variety of diseases. Almost every organ in the body can become cancerous. And so it's a complex of diseases, some of which are improving in terms of their survival after treatment, and also are declining in terms of their prevalence, like stomach cancer, for example, others of which remain rather intractable, with rather poor 5-year or 10-year survival rates, but nonetheless generally going down. That's for males, similar pattern for females, but of course lower, reflecting the female advantage especially in circulatory disease and also in cancers, although showing a slight bulge here as the late onset of smoking-related diseases among women starts to make an effect around here, whereas it had peaked some time earlier among males because males take up these bad habits before women do. This is just to point out the interruptions which you get when the international classification is revised. It's, as I pointed out earlier on, it's very difficult sometimes to work out exactly what the clinical, physiological, biological changes are which are leading to causes of death. And therefore the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, is revised every few years. The revisions are marked by these vertical lines in this graph from the US. And you can see that there's sometimes some discontinuities. Mostly small, but there's a bigger one here, for example, when certain subdivisions of the cause of death are realized actually to belong somewhere else and to be misdiagnosed. Also important to realize that sometimes rapid increases in causes of death are caused not so much because that particular condition is genuinely becoming more common, but because it's being recognized as a genuine clinical entity and previously wasn't. The obvious example is Alzheimer's disease. This pale green line here is the mortality from Alzheimer's disease, almost negligible in about 1980, and now, of course, rising up to a high level and reclassified in 2000. Alzheimer's disease was certainly with us back here. It just wasn't diagnosed, or rather recognized as a clinical entity. Another example of that are the so-called cot deaths, the sudden unexpected death syndrome of infants, which isn't on this graph, but was not recognized at all back in the 1970s, and then once it became recognized, shot up to quite a high level within the context of infant mortality, which of course is at an absolutely low level. This is a log scale graph, and so it gives you a misleading impression of the decline of heart disease and cancer in the US. The reduction which this graph embodies from 1958 until 2005 is actually very great. It's even bigger than that which we saw in England and Wales. Japan is different. Generally speaking, in the developed world, it's the same trio of bad things that cause death in older age. In Japan, the pattern has always been different. The cerebrovascular disease, stroke, started off being more important than heart disease, quite unlike Western Europe. Cancer, malignant neoplasms, has become the most important cause of death, putting these in the shade. And cancer is going up in Japan, despite the fact that, as we know, expectation of life at birth is very favorable. It may well be that if this trend continues and this goes up to 2008, that the Japanese superiority in survival may stutter to an end. We will have to wait and see. Huge variation within Europe in these causes. The left-hand column is ischemic heart disease, chronic and acute heart disease, the single most important cause of death in most developed countries. These are the standardized death rates. Never mind all the data, all the detail. This is ranked, the table is ranked according to the magnitude of the death rate from circulatory disease. As you can see, France has the lightest burden, 49. Ukraine has 10 times the level, 499. UK not doing terribly well, but things get a lot worse when you move from Western Europe into Eastern Europe, with Romania, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe as a whole being 216. So we're less than the European average, but not doing terribly well compared with others. CVD is cerebrovascular disease, which is stroke. PAD is pulmonary artery disease, blood clots in the pulmonary artery, which is an important cause of death, but often misdiagnosed. Very likely, I think, this very great variation here is partly due to changes in diagnosis. It's difficult to believe that pulmonary artery disease in UK can be only about a third of the level in Germany, for example. Cancer, likewise, this table is ranked according to the magnitude of cancer according to various different causes. Trachea, bronchus, and lung cancer here varying about twofold between Portugal there and Poland there, with Hungary doing worst. The worst ones are in heavy type. These are the patterns for ischemic heart disease by geography, reflecting, as you would imagine, given the enormous importance of ischemic heart disease, the pattern of overall mortality, which I displayed earlier on. Dark means worse in this particular graph, and we see the east-west gradient, and we see also the traditional superiority of France, Italy, and Scandinavia compared with Germany, Poland, Austria, and England and Wales. So there's a north-south gradient, a rather patchy north-south U-shaped gradient, as well as a very clear east-west gradient in these patterns of mortality. Still, there are substantial levels of difference in mortality between countries, you know, living rather similar ways of life, doing the same kind of job, driving the same kind of car, eating not quite the same kind of food, but not all that different. Nonetheless, enormous differences in mortality risk, which are very interesting as well as being rather serious. That's just stroke, and we'll move on from that. So we have a lot to explain, and lots of possible explanations for it. There are obviously within these countries in the developed world differences in national wealth, from $45,000 US per year equivalent in Luxembourg down to about 15,000 in some of the East European countries, or even less than that. National health expenditure, private and public, varies considerably between countries. Inequality of health, which Wilkinson is very keen on emphasizing as an important determinant of overall mortality, notably in his controversial new book called The Spirit Level, is another important contender. All that's related to the underlying clinical risk factors of mortality, typically, of course, the kinds of diseases we're talking about, high levels of cholesterol, blood pressure, smoking habits, excessive drinking, especially binge drinking, and other aspects of lifestyle, but those are the most important. And also we'll find, I think, in Eastern Europe especially, that politics matters. Politics matters in terms of the extent to which the national wealth is turned into health expenditure. Different countries have different priorities. Politics also matters in terms of freedom of information, in the extent to which it's possible or easy to discuss causes of death, if the extent to which public discussion can really take account of what's going on with the national mortality levels, what are the risk factors. We are accustomed to a situation where there are dozens and dozens of magazines devoted to healthy living and all kinds of gossip and information, some of it contradictory, about how to live a long and healthy life. In other countries, particularly in the East, in the past especially, this has not been possible, partly because the data haven't been there and partly because the freedom of information hasn't been there to discuss it. This is total health expenditure in dollars, US dollars per head, around about 2005. As you might expect, there's an east-west gradient which fits the pattern we saw before. I'm afraid this graph does not actually show very closely the difference between the top quartile and the middle and the next quartile down, which is a shame, because it's better on the screen. It shows that there's more expenditure, as you see here, in Germany and in France and in the Netherlands, in Switzerland and Austria, rather less in Italy and Spain and the UK, rather more in Norway, rather less in Sweden. The data aren't here, but I think you probably already know from other sources that the correlation between health expenditure in US dollars per head, standardized for exchange rates, or any other measure, on the one hand, and any measure of national health is not very great. Of course, it's true that the richer countries, which spend more of their bigger GDP on health than the poorer countries, tend to do better. That's not surprising. But within the richer countries, the correlation is really quite weak. The US spends about 15% of its very considerable GDP upon health and produces really rather mediocre results, no better than the average of Western Europe, where health expenditure is, I think, universally lower. Germany, which spends about the same per capita as France, does not have the same French superior levels of survival, particularly among females. Italy and Spain, which don't spend all that much compared with others on health, taking all expenditure together, as we saw, have very superior levels of survival compared with the rest. Norway and Sweden aren't that different in health expenditure, are that different in health expenditure, but they're about the same in terms of survival rate. So there's a lot more to it than proportion of GDP spent upon health. What about these diseases of affluence? Can we understand anything from those? Are they, as used to be thought, the inevitable consequence of old age, something which is powerfully age-related and inexorably age-related and which cannot really be controlled or modified very much? Or are they susceptible to intervention either by a more knowledge-based form of healthy living and high-powered medical intervention? The latter appears to be true, and it's clear that there's been a shift in that diseases of affluence are no longer diseases of affluence. These diseases of affluence, the heart disease, the cancer, the strokes, and all the rest of them, which used to be more common in richer countries than poorer countries, more common among richer people than poorer people in the first half of the 20th century, for example, has now shifted round. They are now more common among poorer people than richer people in the developed world, as you saw from the standardized mortality ratios which I showed earlier on. They're also more common among the poorer group of the developed world countries than among the richer ones. And increasingly, to, as it were, reprise the pattern of the early 20th century, they're becoming more common among the more developed of the developing world countries, where heart disease, obesity, and all sorts of other problems are now quite a problem among the middle class in India, and also among the middle class in Brazil and other countries of that kind, with obesity levels really at almost European or even British sorts of levels. One of the important variables which helps to explain the relative weakness of the financial aspect of investment in health are lifestyle patterns, particularly the so-called Mediterranean diet. At the risk of sounding like a margarine advert, it really does appear to work. This is a simple diagram of what the ideal Mediterranean diet is, based upon the diet characteristic of parts of Greece, like Crete, some decades ago. The Cretans have now moved on from this very healthy thing and are now becoming fat because they're eating lots of beef and things. But this is the ideal. Meat just monthly. Eggs, poultry, fish, and sweet things weekly, plus and wine. Lots of cheese and yogurt. Olive oil, very central to this. Daily consumption of cheese and yogurt, olive oil, fruits, beans, legumes, and vegetables. This sounds terribly wholesome and boring of me, but it does appear to be true that this does make a difference. Not only does it make a difference in terms of helping to explain international differences and why relatively poor countries, especially poorer in the past, like Italy and Spain and Greece, had low levels of mortality, but also in terms of clinical treatment. One of the interestingly clinching evidences of this is a pattern in Albania. Albania is a country in Eastern Europe, as you know. It was a sort of communist country where the communist dictator Enver Hoxha quarreled not only with Stalin but also with Mao and became a completely isolated entity all by himself, deeply impoverished. He covered the country with over 100,000 little forts, which are still there, sort of concrete bunkers to protect himself from attack from anywhere, behaved with great ferocity towards outsiders of any kind, exterminated religion, none whatever, and kept the country poor. Despite that, the expectation of life at birth in Albania continued to improve from admittedly low levels throughout the whole of the communist period, quite unlike that pattern which I showed earlier on. And of course, it is now believed the reason for that is partly because the poverty of Albania protected it from high levels of meat and fat intake, but also because Albania, being a country on the Adriatic, a part of the Mediterranean, benefited from this pattern of Mediterranean diet for quite a long while. Things will no doubt change now that Albania is becoming more affluent. And even more interestingly was the fact that those coastal parts of Albania, where this kind of diet was easy to obtain, had superior survival levels to the more mountainous inland parts of Albania, where this was less often practiced. So a curious little tiny piece of evidence from the more remote parts of Eastern Europe, southeastern Europe. This rather complex graph is just to try and lend some scientific verisimilitude to my generalizations about this diet. Not only is it a very good contender for helping to explain why some poor southern countries have superior survival rates, it also, even more convincingly, when used as a therapeutic measure, has dramatic and predictable results upon levels of mortality from heart disease, stroke, and also, surprisingly, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other conditions. This is a meta-analysis of 12 prospective studies whereby people at risk of death from these conditions in various different countries have been divided into one group which was put onto a conventionally good diet and another group put onto a more severe Mediterranean diet, a total sample size of 1.5 million people. And all the studies show an improvement. The details don't matter, but this is no improvement. On the left-hand side is improvement. 2 steps in the scale of the Mediterranean diet produce between 10 and 30% improvement in survival. Yeah.
What was the alternative diet?
The alternative diet was one which tried to avoid the excesses of meat and fat, which some of those in the study had previously been following, and which was what we would regard as a reasonable diet of the kind we normally eat, as opposed to something rather more specialized. It varied between studies. There were 12 studies here, you see, so I don't really know what the average of the 12 was. This has been responsible for some interesting reversals in mortality, or so we believe. This shows the pattern of mortality in Italy on the left and France on the right in different provinces from the beginning of the 20th century up to the latter part of the 20th century. This, for example, is Italy in 1911. The darker areas are the areas with the lower survival, with higher death rates. And as you can see, as you might imagine, poverty-stricken, malaria-infested southern Italy had higher death rates in those days than the more prosperous, more as it were, European north. Partly because the infectious disease was much less well controlled here in this much more poor rural area. By the time we get to 1981, the position is totally reversed. Here, the higher mortality levels are found in the more developed, richer northern part of Italy, where people are very much living ways of life similar to those experienced in neighbouring Austria and other parts of Europe. Down here in the south, the pattern of mortality is much lower. The burden of infectious disease has been eradicated by this time, as it has been throughout Europe, east and west. But this part of the country is experiencing the benefits still was in 1981 anyway, the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. This was not the case here, where the diet is much more like that which the neighbouring Germanic populations tend to eat. Likewise in France, back in, this is 1901, the highest mortality areas in France were down here in the south, and some over here in poverty-stricken Brittany and Normandy. By the time we get to 1981, it's completely reversed. It's believed the same sort of reason. All sorts of interesting changes going on of that kind. The special problem of the high mortality levels among males in Eastern Europe, which I mentioned, has puzzled many people. The proximate causes are quite clear. It's to do with very high and not diminishing rates of heart disease, quite high and increasing rates of cancer, very high levels of accidents and violence, particularly related to drink, but it's by no means all of that, although that's the best known aspects of this high mortality, I guess. One general theory put forward by Elwood Carlson is the pattern of mortality in these countries, which is unique to the former communist countries, and also is concentrated among men of older working age, not so much among women, not so much among children, not so much among old people. He calls this the state socialist mortality syndrome, and in brief attributes it to the forced industrialization and the forced urbanization which took place more or less throughout this era, from 1917 or 1920 in the case of Russia, from 1945 in the case of Central and Eastern Eastern Europe, outside Russia, which transformed a rural, poor population practicing mostly primary activities into one forced into secondary and tertiary activities, particularly secondary ones, industrial activity, often of an extremely dangerous kind, which led to major changes in social organization, the disruption of family structure, the concentration of population in very inadequate, rapidly built urban housing, and all the rest of it, which you can see there. It's a complex theory, one which it would take a long time to expand properly. But as far as Elwood Carlson and others too are concerned, the primary ultimate reason for these interesting and very distinctive patterns of mortality is socio-political and not to do with random changes in mortality for other reasons. What happens next? Onwards and upwards appears to be the sign that the graphs are all pointing upwards in the West anyway. I mean Western Europe, the US and other developed countries outside Eastern Europe. Those parts of Eastern Europe which are reformed, like those parts which have joined the EU, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, which have joined the European Union, their death rates are all moving upwards again, as they should have been for the last 50 years, but haven't been. How long can this continue? All sorts of factors argue one way and the other. And this is a strong argument, a strong source of dispute among my colleagues. In fact, of all the arguments within demography, aside from migration, the argument as to the likelihood of continued improvements onwards and upwards for a long time in survival, compared with the likelihood of this grinding to a halt thanks to obesity and so on, generates some of the most fierce arguments, even personally hostile arguments, anywhere in the subject. All sorts of reasons lead one to suppose that things will continue to improve. Fundamental objections are raised to this in terms of the impossibility of any organism being capable of self-repair for endless periods of time, and the difficulty of reinventing the entire human body through technical innovation. And also the more practical objections are raised against the prospect of continual mortality improvement arising from this really very alarming level of rising obesity, of which you'll doubtless know a great deal through Stanley Oliasik's lectures, and other sorts of problems, the possible re-emergence of old diseases, the possibility of bird flu mutating into something seriously epidemically damaging, and so on. The improvements are clearly going to take place, and have been taking place, at older ages. Mortality below age 60 is now so low that even if it were totally abolished, it would not make a very big difference to expectation of life at birth. About 97% of newborn babies now can expect to live to age 60. So getting rid of that mortality is going to be difficult, and also will not make much difference. The improvement is going to take place, as it has been taking place over the last 40 years or so, in the population aged over 65, which cheers me up no end. As you can see in this graph, from 1850 up to the middle of the century, very little improvement in expectation of life at age 65. From then onwards, starting particularly with females and then later on among males, it's been increasing at an exponential rate. And it is there that further improvement must take place in order for the overall expectation of life to continue increasing at the very satisfactory linear pattern which has been showing for some time now. Here's just one of very large numbers of warnings against expectation of continued improvement arising out of obesity and the transmission of obesity from children to parents, which is a very serious problem. These are the uncertain expectations of the Office of National Statistics. This is their projection for expectation of life at birth from the 2008 projections, going up by 2081 to about 93 for females and about 88 for males. Typically, the pattern of linear improvement which they allow to continue in these projections until 2030 is then bent downwards. Actuaries hate linear improvements in mortality. And partly for scientific reasons and partly for reasons of caution, it is, as you see, bent here in the principal projections. The higher projection, the alternative, the face-saving alternative projection of the higher level, leaves these to be continued in a linear fashion, reaching nearly 100, as you see, for females by 2081 and about 97 for males. That will be really very interesting. This is the pessimistic possibility. This is the other alternative projection showing no improvement at all after 2031, with them sticking at more or less Japanese levels. That's really very, very pessimistic. But we will see which of those is right. That's the difference between England and Wales and Scotland. We'll pass on away from that. We're getting to some very interesting expectations of life at birth. Here is Madame Jeanne Calment, who died at age 122. I'm very sorry that I couldn't find a photograph of her with her customary glass of red wine in her hand and her previously frequently smoked cigarettes in her mouth. But that's what she used to do, and she felt that all that stuff about cigarettes and wine was all nonsense. And here she is in 1997. 122 is so far unbeaten. Here is Edgar Sharp, born 1886 and died at age 108 in 1994, in his youth, in his marriage, and in his old age. Here is Henry Allingham, who was the world's oldest man, born in 1899, fought at the Battle of Jutland, and here he is at the cenotaph. In 2004, and just died a couple of years ago. So the maximum age at life, of expectation of life is getting greater. The numbers of centenarians is hugely increasing. The centenarians are the most rapidly increasing group of people in Western Europe. They'll be numbered in their millions by the end of the century if things go on as they are. So the pattern is a favourable one. Mortality is falling. Every year that passes, we get a bonus of 3 months extra in terms of expectation of life on current trends, which cheers me up no end. Big 20th century divergences between West and Eastern Europe, which have by no means yet entirely evaporated. They're still alive and unwell in Eastern Europe. Persistent differences in levels of mortality also between social groups, between occupational groups, income groups, social classes. The interest nowadays, of course, is powerfully focused upon survival of people in older ages. That's where all the improvement has been happening and has to continue to happen if the overall level of survival is going to continue to increase. Something I've not spoken of for lack of time is the paramount importance of these extra years of life being predominantly years of active, enjoyable, useful, and possibly employable life. If the extra years of life are primarily going to be spent drooling in a wheelchair, this is not going to be very beneficial to anyone at all. All sorts of unsolved scientific problems about the likelihood of future improvements in survival, the extent to which the human genome in its present form can sustain a continual repair of DNA and cell processes into older life. Important also to realise that given that the birth rate has now ceased to fall and appears to be creeping upwards even, that beyond, after the next 2 or 3 decades, all future patterns of population ageing are going to be determined by future levels of human survival and not by the birth rate. I will stop there. Thank you very much.